This lesson covers the deployment and using of Bitlocker in your environment. So as I already talked about, Bitlocker is an optional feature in Windows Server 2012. So you enable this via Server Manager or PowerShell, and then the actual configuration of Bitlocker can be done through a Bitlocker control panel applet, the command line, there's a manage BDE script, or new to Windows Server 2012 is PowerShell. So I'm actually going to quickly jump over and just show you where this Bitlocker is. So I'm going to add roles and features on local server. And I'm just going to enable Bitlocker Drive Encryption, or BDE. Let's say restart automatically if required, and install. So this is now going to add a number of things. It installs the Bitlocker code. That spare system volume is already there. So when I say spare, it's obviously already the active partition. It has the boot code, but there's no encrypted volumes yet. So it's going to add a control panel applet to let me manage Bitlocker install the PowerShell. I'm going to let that continue. Also new to Windows Server 2012 is the ability to enable Bitlocker from Windows PE. So what this allows you to do is typically when you enable Bitlocker, it has to go and encrypt all of the existing content on a volume. Well, that could be quite a lot of time. There might be 10, 12, 15 gigabytes of data. By being able to enable Bitlocker from Windows PE, I can turn on Bitlocker before any data is written to the volume. So it's basically zero overhead. And additionally, Windows Server 2012 enables the option to encrypt only the used disk space instead of the whole disk. In the previous lesson, I talked about it actually would create a temporary file and fill up the entire volume so it could be encrypted. Well, you can skip that. So again, imagine combining this with encrypting from Windows PE on an empty drive. You'll basically be able to turn Bitlocker on in seconds. Additionally, a great new feature is you can now use this on cluster shared volumes. So if I have a Windows 2012 cluster and I'm using cluster shared volumes, that enables me to access a LUN that's formatted NTFS from all the nodes in a cluster concurrently, well, I can now protect that with Bitlocker. Now I want to quickly go through some of the key group policy options. So if you go to Computer Configuration, Policies, Administrative Templates, Windows Components, Bitlocker, I can configure a number of options. So I have something called Store the Bitlocker Recovery Information in Active Directory. And I have this set to enabled, and actually it's required. So what is this? Remember with the encrypted file system, it may happen that a user loses their private key. And so the domain has a recovery agent. So in a worst case scenario, you can still get to that encrypted data. Well, imagine the same scenario with Bitlocker. Maybe a user is selected to use a PIN, or they're using a USB drive and they forget their PIN. They lose their USB stick. Well, that volume is now completely encrypted and cannot be accessed. So when Bitlocker is turned on, a recovery key is created, which is a very large 48-digit number that you have to type in, but it gives you access to that full volume encryption key from the TPM should you lose your PIN or USB key. Now, when you encrypt a drive with Bitlocker, it will actually prompt you to save this somewhere securely or print it. It won't let you save it to the same disk you're encrypting. That would be very silly. But what this group policy option allows me to do is I can say when I enable Bitlocker, for any machine in the domain, that Bitlocker key will actually get backed up to a child object of the computer account in Active Directory. So this gives me a great way to ensure I can always get access to that recovery key. So I would definitely recommend in an AD environment you have that enabled. Now the only requirement to use this is your domain must have the Windows Server 2008 schema updated, because this is what allows that Bitlocker recovery password to be stored as a child object. So you need to make sure you've enabled that. And there are a lot of other settings you can configure, so take some time and go through these. But what's of interest to me right now is this require additional authentication at startup. So by default, to turn on Bitlocker, you have to have a TPM. But in a virtual machine, which is what I want to demonstrate, I don't have a TPM. So I'm turning on this Allow Bitlocker without a compatible TPM. And what it's going to do is it's now going to store that sort of full volume encryption key to a USB or a floppy drive. And I'm going to say I'm allowing a startup key. So I've turned on this option. But again, there are lots of different settings. I can allow enhanced pins, all different things. Same for data drives. I can configure the use of smart cards. I can say types of encryption. Do I want to enforce encryption on fixed data drives? Do I want to block, for example, removable drives if they're not protected by Bitlocker? So you can now say only enable data to be written to a USB drive if it's encrypted with Bitlocker. So lots of different group policies. Then when I go back to that server, it rebooted that I enabled the Bitlocker feature on. Now I want to go ahead and actually turn on Bitlocker. So in the control panel, I have a Bitlocker drive encryption control panel applet. And I can say I want to turn on Bitlocker. It's going to verify the requirements are met. And here I can say, do I want to have to insert a USB drive or enter a password to decrypt the machine? So I can say enter a password, type in whatever that password is, and continue. But I'm actually going to do this from the command line instead. So what I'm going to do here is open up a command prompt. Now in the past, you used something called manage-bde WSF. It was a script file. Now in Windows Server 2012, that's actually been replaced with it's still called manage-bde, but it's now an executable. And additionally, there's actually PowerShell scripts instead now. So I can use PowerShell commandlets to do all of this. So here I'm going to use PowerShell, and you see I've got the help available for enable Bitlocker. Now I could absolutely use that manage-bde. I can specify a protector, but what I want to do is actually show it using the new PowerShell. So I'm going to say I want to enable Bitlocker on my C drive. I want a startup key protector, and that startup key path is going to be on the A drive. I want to skip the hardware test, and I want to say used space only because it's a virtual machine and it's thinly provisioned. So this is now going to go through, and you can see it's actually started the encryption. And I can get the status of that. So I can use get Bitlocker volume C, and I can format it as a list if I want to get some detailed information. So I can still, it's still at 1%. And this is obviously going to take some time. It's going through and encrypting this machine. Likewise, I could go and look at the Bitlocker, and I can see it's encrypting here. Now, while it's doing that, on my A drive, if I view hidden items, and I also turn on my option to not hide protected operating system files, I now see these are the files it's actually using to store that key. So what I've also done now is I just use manage-bde to add a recovery password. Now this wasn't done automatically because I'm doing everything through PowerShell, but I wanted this recovery password. So here you can see I've created that 48-digit recovery password. So this is what you really need to keep securely, and don't forget to do this. If you use the graphical interface, this is created for you automatically. But if you don't, if you use PowerShell, you need to make sure you configure this through the PowerShell commands. And like I say, I wanted to show you manage-bde, and all I did is I added a protector of type recovery password. I can get a list of all the protectors in my environment. I can say get C. And you can see I've got some external keys, and I've got my numeric password, and it has an identifier. Now I set that group policy to back up my recovery passwords to AD, but again, because I'm not using the graphical interface, that didn't happen. So I'm going to use manage-bde, my protectors, and I'm going to say I want an AD backup for C, the ID of that protector. So you'll notice here, I actually ran that command in a command prompt. I actually received an error in PowerShell about it being non-interactive. Remember, PowerShell isn't really a command prompt interface. It lets me run a lot of command prompt executables, but it doesn't always function as expected. So I actually reran that command in a command prompt, and you can see it successfully backed it up to the Active Directory. If I now look at the Active Directory, we see that that computer now has a new child object of type full volume encryption recovery information. In here, I can actually see my recovery password. So this is now how, if a user had forgotten that recovery key, they could phone up the help desk and they could give them this recovery key. You could also expose this through a script, for example, so users could automatically get this. For large enterprises, Microsoft has the Microsoft Bitlocker Administration and Management tool, MBAM. And this actually enables end users to do that self-recovery automatically and even generate a new recovery password should they have to use the old one. Notice from a group policy perspective, I do want to make sure I cover all of those settings. So this is my Bitlocker policy that enabled that AD to work. So if I edit this policy, I can see all the settings I configured. So on administrative templates, system, trusted platform module, I've enabling the backup to Active Directory. Then under Windows Components, under Bitlocker, so I enabled both the store Bitlocker recovery information in Active Directory, and I enabled the choose how users can recover. And then you can set different options for operating system, fixed, and removable. So for operating systems, I required allow the BitLocker without a TPM, which enabled me to set this in the virtual machine. And make sure you have enabled choose how BitLocker protected operating system drives can be recovered and store in Active Directory. And you could also say omit those recovery options from the setup wizard so it just does this automatically, and don't enable BitLocker unless it's stored in the Active Directory. Those same settings can be set, for example, for the data drives. So choose how BitLocker protected, allow recovery agent and store in Active Directory. And likewise, you could set for the removable drives. So with all of those settings enabled, it enabled me to save that recovery key to the Active Directory, which is what you can see right here. And certainly for any production environment, I always recommend storing that recovery key in Active Directory. So that encryption is now finished, and also I can see that in the control panel. Now notice, now it's turned on, I have this option to suspend protection or turn off BitLocker. So the big deal here is suspend protection uses basically a clear encryption key. It means you don't have to type in any PIN, any USB drive. And you typically want to do that if you're maybe changing the structure. Maybe you're repartitioning the drives, you're changing the hardware. Because if you don't suspend protection and you just make changes, you'll actually invalidate the configuration and you'll be prompted to have to type in the recovery key. So anytime you're making a major change to the operating system, you need to make sure you suspend protection first. It doesn't decrypt the volume. As I say, it just uses that clear key. And then once you've finished making changes, resume protection. Turning off BitLocker will actually decrypt the drive. So you only want to do that when you're basically done with using that BitLocker technology. This is actually a phenomenal document, the Microsoft BitLocker frequently asked questions page. And it actually talks, for example, about why do I have to use that recovery key? What changes cause that integrity check to fail? So such as a new motherboard, disabling or clearing the TPM. What causes the recovery key to be required? And notice it's talking about all those things I mentioned, changes to the NTFS partition table, changing the boot order, adding a new operating system. So actually take some time, look at this FAQ. It's a really great resource. The other great resource is Understand and Troubleshoot BitLocker in Windows Server 8 Beta. Now it's not been updated for the final release, but it's a great document. I have it downloaded here. And basically this goes through all the different types of technology, how to use Managed BDE, how to use PowerShell, how you could script this to automatically work. It goes through details of all the different Managed BDE commands, setting up all the processes. So take some time, download this document, read this, definitely understand how to use the Managed BDE, how to use the PowerShell. So covered a lot of information in this lesson, but hopefully it gives you an idea of the configurability of BitLocker and some of those policies you'd want to use in your domain to ensure it functions as you wish, and also to make sure you never lose access to a BitLocker protected system. Definitely look at this FAQ and this document from Microsoft. And this concludes the lesson on deploying and using BitLocker.